It's the week ending Saturday the 6th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a 7.5 magnitude earthquake striking the Noto Peninsula in Japan, junior doctors striking in the longest ever industrial action in NHS history, and 16-year-old darts player Luke Littler just missing out on becoming the youngest ever world champion. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And a very happy new year to you. Joining me today from the Week's digital team is Harriet Marsden and Rebecca Evans. And from Money Week, Mr. Guy Anker. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Harriet, is you kicking us off this week? What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week that London got its own Trump?
Katie Hopkins called the London mayor, quotes, our nipple height mayor of Londonistan. And you replied, thank you, Katie. Why?
I can't remember doing that. Probably because I'm so
You can't remember doing that?
No, of course not. The Nick, I tweet, or used to,
Do you
all
remember
the
liking
time.
a tweet that had the language, it's never too late to get London back, with a picture of Enoch Powell?
Yes, and I've explained that. It's never too late, which is what I'm saying to you. It is not too late to make London better again. We've got traffic jams left, right and centre. We've got the ULEZ expansion.
Are you a fan of Enoch Powell?
No, of course not.
But why? I don't understand. There was a picture of him, and you liked that tweet.
I know. If you're a serial tweeter, you tend to go through liking all sorts of things, and you sometimes read things and don't see it. If anybody is offended, then obviously I would apologise.
Nick Ferrari interviewing Susan Hall on LBC last year. Harriet, who is she and why is she in the news this week?
So Susan Hall is the Conservative candidate for the London mayoral election in May, and she's back in the news again this week because the London Mayor Sadiq Khan has hit out at her and kind of obliquely compared her with Donald Trump. He said this year there is every chance we could see Donald Trump in the White House, Suella Braverman in number 10 and Susan Hall in London City Hall. So it's punchy stuff, it's hyperbolic, but I think it's a reflection of her rising profile and, as we've heard, her social media activity.
Yeah, just explain that for us then. I mean, what did she do on social media exactly? And is there any conceivable way you could say that makes her either Donald Trump or even comparable with Suella Braverman?
So her social media activity has been very, 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 very strange. I mean, it's largely been kind of uncovered and publicised by the campaign group Hope Not Hate. What Nick Ferrari was talking about there was she liked tweets praising Enoch Powell, obviously who's very famous for his Rivers of Blood speech. She's retweeted far-right troll Katie Hopkins describing London as Londonistan, which is obviously it's a very, very, very well-known Islamophobic and far-right conspiracy trope. And she's an overt backer of Trump, and she has said that the people who stormed the Capitol during the riots in America can be compared with politicians who didn't back Brexit. So it's really attention-grabbing stuff. And she's recently been embroiled in another controversy of her comments about Jewish people, saying Jewish people are afraid of Sadiq Khan.
But Guy, do you think that is a fair representation of what Susan Hall is actually promising voters at the ballot box? I mean, that's what Sadiq Khan is obviously latching on to, but that's not her offer, is it? These are comments that she's made that are sort of unfortunate for her. But I mean, what she wants to campaign on is things like ULEZ.
I think it's an example of the polarisation of politics. You know, people are placed in far right, far left pockets. Jeremy Corbyn placed far left, for example. Trump far right. These are not my views necessarily. This is where I think society places them. In terms of her policies, you can certainly see a sort of a more draconian edge to her. You know, she's talked about going even harder, for example, on tube fare evaders. She's very, very critical of Khan. She's called him a walking disaster. London is sick to death of him over his record on knife crime and things like that. So look, I don't think she's promising to be like Donald Trump, but I don't quite understand why anybody would. She said she doesn't endorse Enoch Powell. I don't know why you'd actually use someone like that in your social media. If I happen to have the same view as Vladimir Putin on something, I wouldn't use Vladimir Putin to sort of back up my view. So while I don't think her policies are I think maybe Sadiq Khan's gone a bit too far, but I still wonder why she would use such language or such analogies. And by the way, speaking as someone who's Jewish, I'm not personally afraid of Sadiq Khan, I would just say, as on top of that.
I mean, her answer to Guy's question, why would you do something like that, Rebecca, would be something akin to what she was just trying to explain to Nick Ferrari there, which was, well, I didn't really make a conscious decision at all. I'm a sloppy user of social media. I like to tweet. I didn't think through the implications. I didn't really properly look at it. I mean, is that a reasonable defence?
No, well, at least I don't think so. I think it's quite a cop out to suggest that you're not aware or you're not taking precautions with your social media when you're retweeting things like Enoch Powell and comments referring to London as Londonistan, for example. But it's not just her tweets. She's said arguably problematic things in political conversations, such as the black community allegedly has a crime problem and that Notting Hill is dangerous, for example. I just think that someone who is claiming to be so lackadaisical with her social media, are they someone that is really fit to be London mayor? I mean, we've experienced some frankly shocking levels of political barrel scraping in recent history, but I think this takes it to new levels.
Does it? I mean, does it really? I mean, again, Harriet, does it really compare to Donald Trump?
No, so the reason that I chose this story, I also would like to say, Sadiq Khan didn't overtly compare her with Donald Trump. He basically made a very oblique reference to her being part of the
swing to the right.
threat of the rise of the far right in Europe and beyond. So what he actually said was that she's repeatedly promoting divisive and racist content. So the reason that I chose this story is because it's about a lot more than just London. It's about this. She's tapped into this wider network, this wider far-right conspiracy theory of Londonistan and the... it's an international trope. It's a conspiracy theory of so-called Eurabia. The idea being that Arab powers are trying to Islamize or Arabize Europe to weaken its ties with America. So it's not that she can conceivably be compared with Donald Trump, not for political influence nor for kind of extremism, but the fact that she's chosen to kind of engage in these tropes and these international tropes suggests she's trying to piggyback on this wider network and this rising far-right threat around the world.
Except there is just, a straightforward interpretation of what she said, Guy, which is to believe her, that she didn't really know how to use Twitter and she was just pressing like without really thinking what it meant. And there is actually a lack of clarity, isn't there, on ex-Twitter, about what like is. Is it a bookmark? Is it a way of saying to someone who follows you, I see you and I thank you for your comment? Is it necessarily... You said she was sharing the views of Enoch Powell. She retweeted an image of Enoch Powell with some words that she didn't write, that someone else wrote. I mean, it was obviously a mistake, but you could believe her, couldn't you, when she says, I didn't know what I was doing?
Well, as I said, I would never use a public figure that I vehemently didn't like or that society generally conceives as, let's say, bad, to back up a point I was making. You're right, Ollie. It is, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. It's easy to accidentally press like. I've done it before, but not on sensitive things like that. But also, if you've done that, it's very easy to unlike something. And if it's brought to your attention and you say it was a mistake, then surely you then unlike it. But I also think, going back to the point around, where is she on this scale? I don't think she's Donald Trump. She's definitely further to the right than Sadiq Khan. But I think we just also have to be careful about, people on the left will, make out people further to the right of them as extremists, and vice versa, of course. We've got to be careful there. But what I would say, London is generally, and I'm very much generalising here, is generally left-leaning. You saw it with the Brexit vote. You see it with the make-up generally politically. So it's kind of a strange choice, I think, for however extreme right you want to put her. I don't think matters, but certainly for a more right-leaning candidate in London. I don't know if it's the right city for her to go for.
Or is it just actually the choice, Rebecca, of a party that thinks they're not going to win for the reasons that Guy just said? I mean, the Conservatives have only won Mayor of London under Boris Johnson, this incredibly charismatic figure before he was Prime Minister, and everyone was aware of all of his faults. In this scenario, are they thinking, well, we're not going to win anyway, we'll put up this, frankly, fairly weak candidate that doesn't know how to use social media, but it doesn't really matter?
Potentially that's what they're doing, but I think it would be very unwise for them politically to do such a thing, particularly as the general election is all but decided. So I imagine the Tory party would want some level of influence, and where best to have that level of influence than in the capital city? So I think it's just a bit, as Guy says, it's just a bit odd, the choice of such a controversial character with such a dubious reputation to put forward for this role, particularly if the Tory party want to continue to have at least some level of political influence on a high level.
And actually, despite what I just said, Harriet, there are people who think that because of the new electoral rules around the London mayoral election, the Tories might have a much better chance of winning than they ever have before. Explain that to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important part of context of this story. So Sadiq Khan is still well in the lead to win in May, but he has criticised the government's changes to the mayoral electoral system, which could work in Hall's favour. So it's been changed from a supplementary vote system, which is where you have a first choice, and then if that choice is bumped out, then you have a second choice, which is a system that, like, if you choose a Green candidate, for example, or a Lib Dem candidate, those votes might often be transferred then to a Labour candidate. Yeah. It's changed to a first past the post system, which could work in the Conservatives' favour. It's also, they've introduced mandatory photo ID, which could lower turnout among young voters and particularly ethnic minority voters who, not to generalise, but who would be expected to be more likely to vote Labour. So these are two changes that could work in Hall's favour. But just to pick up on Guy's point about London being a very left-leaning city, it is, but perhaps not as much as we'd think. So if you look at previous mayoral elections, Sadiq Khan only beat Zach Goldsmith by 57% to 43 about that in 2016. And he ran what was described at the time as an overtly racist Islamophobic campaign. And Sean Bailey, Sadiq Khan beat him by an even smaller margin, and he shared a tweet with a photo of Sadiq Khan and the caption, "The Mad Mullah of Londonistan." So these are actually not as big a wipeouts in Sadiq Khan's favour as you'd think, and he is going for a historic third term, and as the incumbent, that could work against him as well.
Yeah, what about that, actually, Guy? I mean, for people listening to this thinking, what is the relevance of the Mayor of London at all to my life if they don't live in London? This historic third term idea, I mean, that would put him actually on a platform with, the most enduring politicians in British history, wouldn't it, if he wins 3 elections? Should there be a 2-term limit on the mayoralty? Is it right that someone can win 3 in a row and govern London? It's an important position.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Obviously, you can compare that with the US president with the 2-term rule. I don't necessarily have a strong view either way, to be honest with you, on the number of terms. But it is just it's different, isn't it, to being Prime Minister? Because, as we're seeing, when you're Prime Minister, at any point people can threaten to overturn you, unseat you and everything else. If you're Mayor, you're basically Mayor for the whole period. It's locked in. Yeah, but the beauty of a democracy is the people can decide, ultimately. So that's why I don't have a particularly strong view on.
Yeah, but if you want to vote Labour, you've got no one to decide but Sadiq Khan for 9 years now.
That's true, but I mean, there are other options. It's not, being a London mayor is not just about the political party you're affiliated to. When Boris Johnson was London mayor, obviously he was strongly linked to the Tory party, but it was very much Boris Johnson, almost a character. I knew people who voted for Boris Johnson that were Labour supporters. They might have different views now, 15, 20 years later, I don't know. But no, I mean, look, I think the key point to answer your question is that the beauty of democracy is you can get rid of people if you don't want them. Yeah, you're right. There's no black and white to this one. One of the problems is, if Labour is continually putting the same candidate up, that creates a lack of choice. But ultimately, democracy rules.
And Harriet, we could end up with a situation, not quite what Sadiq Khan outlines of Suella Braverman in number 10 and Susan Hall in City Hall, But we could end up with a situation where Susan Hall wins the mayoral election, and then that has a big influence on who the Tories choose as their leader in opposition, because they're going to want someone who can get along with what will be the most significant Tory politician in the country at the point she's Mayor of London and they're not in power anymore.
Yeah, I think it's the London mayor is much more significant, I think, than people think. And it's worth noting, just to pull up Guy's point about democracy rules, it's not quite democracy rules. I mean, with Susan Hall, for example, yes, she was a surprise choice by the Conservatives for the candidacy, but she only received 57% of the Conservative member party vote, which, you know, isn't overwhelming. And she was standing against, she was in a 3-person race with Mozammel Hussain, who is a Bangladeshi-born barrister with like no frontline political experience, and Dan Korsky, who dropped out after being accused of inappropriate behaviour with women. So, like Rebecca said, it's political barrel scraping. I mean, they just didn't have a lot of great candidates. And also, she is a London Assembly member. She is a Harrow councillor, and she was the leader of the London Assembly Conservatives for 4 years. So she knows London political campaigning like the back of her hand. I mean, she's not a nobody. I think it would be wrong to describe her as a political nobody. So it actually makes her quite important. And if we're looking at the possibility of a Trump presidency, another Trump presidency at the end of this year, which is a possibility, it does make a difference having an overtly Trump backing London mayor. I mean, we may remember Sadiq Khan has a very long-standing feud with Donald Trump. It was very high profile, very volatile, and he actually opposed the Trump state visit, and there was the famous Trump blimp baby over London and stuff. So this has wider international significance than just London.
And if you're standing for political office, Rebecca, which inevitably you will one day, no doubt, will you be going back through your social media history and just deleting everything? Is that what you should do when you stand for office?
I just think you've got to be vigilant generally. I mean, if you're in the political sphere, you should be keeping your social media locked tight, regardless of what your actual opinions are. That's equally problematic because you'll have some people that are holding nefarious opinions and perhaps not sharing them on social media. But there's got to be a level of professionalism here. Your social media, whether people like it or not, is your front-facing. The front-facing ability to show yourself and what you stand for and who you are, and that needs to be managed sensitively and appropriately. And
Hall has actually deleted all of her Twitter history before 2017. So
right,
it's not that she's unaware.
Right.
She's not unaware of the importance. She's not probably not the most intelligent person in politics I could think of, but she certainly knows that
she's not stupid.
This is important, and I think it speaks to the wider impact of politics and social media. The more outlandish a politician is online, the more noise they generate, the more coverage they get in the media. So the whole social media journalistic coverage model is like a feedback loop, and it's designed to reward fringe and extremist views.
Worth saying there are 7 other candidates in the London mayoral race. You can follow all the plots as they thicken on the week's website as we build up to May. Guy, you're up next after this. Okay, Guy, over to you. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the tax net closing on eBay sellers?
It seems to me we're being taxed on selling goods that we've already bought with taxed money. It's a risk of double taxation. Why would we do something so ridiculously intrusive? Well, research tells us that once again, it's the great globalist Conservative Party who signed up to this agreement with 27 other countries through the OECD.
Nigel Farage doing his thing on GB News on Wednesday. What was he upset about, Guy?
Yeah, so starting on the 1st of Jan, so-called digital platforms, we're talking eBay, Etsy, Vinted, Airbnb, things that you can sell stuff on or sell services on, such as, rooms in your home. They now have to collect extra info about sellers, including and crucially how many sales they've made and how much income generated. And then the platforms have to share this with HMRC by the end of January next year. Tax rules haven't changed, crucially. This is about the collection of data, and some people will need to pay tax on items they've sold or services that they've sold. But I do stress some people. The clip from Nigel Farage just now sort of implied that anyone selling on eBay will be taxed. That's not the case.
Okay, so what is the case? Especially as you say, the rules haven't actually changed. There might be, I'm sure, in fact, there are many people listening to this who sell stuff on eBay and Vinted and had no idea they were supposed to declare tax. So what's the deal? What are you supposed to do?
So here's the crucial thing. If you're trading, if you're deliberately making a profit, let's say you do up old furniture and sell it on eBay, then that is potentially taxable. I said potentially because there are allowances as well. If you're just selling old stuff, if you've had a baby recently and you're selling your old sterilizer, you're not going to get taxed on that. But if you're deliberately trading to make a profit, and generally with services you will be, so selling your parking space, selling a room in your home, renting out a whole property, that is generally taxable. But just getting rid of old stuff, this is what we just need to... I think there's a danger people are scared by this. I've sold some old CDs on eBay. Don't worry if the purpose was just to get rid of stuff.
Yeah, but you've chosen a couple of examples there that we know aren't worth very much money, right? CDs and sterilizers. But what if you aren't doing it as a business, but you have sold something that's worth £1,000, a designer dress or a second-hand car? What then?
The second-hand car is a good example. I saw someone tweet about this. Sorry, X about this, whatever you call Twitter now.
Did you like it?
The other day. I didn't like it. Well, I liked it, but I didn't press like.
Sure, yeah.
I saw someone worried, I've just sold my car, am I going to get taxed on it? If the purpose was you're just getting rid of a car because let's say, you don't need to drive anymore or you're selling it in order to buy a new one, no, it's not taxable. If you're in a business to do up old cars and sell it, yes, it's your business, it's taxable. And I think there's been a bit of scaremongering around this topic. It's received a lot of attention. Don't get me wrong, lots of people probably aren't paying tax that they that should do. But if you're just selling something to get rid of it, then no, you don't have to pay. The exceptions will come, but really, really high value items that have increased in value, there might be capital gains tax on that. But there's still an allowance of which you don't pay tax on capital gains. But I think those cases will be few and far between.
I suppose the point is, though, Rebecca, particularly generationally, having a side hustle can easily go from being a project that you're doing for fun or because you're clearing out your loft into being something more like a business but not quite your business. You might be a PAYE employee somewhere else and suddenly your business selling old handbags that you pick up in Oxfam becomes something of interest to the taxman when it wasn't when you started. You can see how there are some blurred lines with these platforms.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I think particularly with the cost of living crisis, many people will be exploring the kind of ways that they can make money on the side. And perhaps they're not aware of the tax implications of that until, obviously, as Guy's saying, this story has come up. I mean, I think HMRC know what they're doing here. Some statistics that I found were that the UK side hustles generate approximately £72 billion for the UK economy, and that 44% of people in the UK currently have at least one side hustle. So HMRC understands that this is growing in popularity, and I think, although tax rules are not changing, this idea of these platforms reporting this information back to HMRC is the taxman taking advantage of people developing their side hustles into perhaps more significant businesses.
And in a sense, Harriet, should have happened ages ago, shouldn't it? I mean, isn't it sort of remarkable? eBay's 28 years old. How's it taken this long for HMRC to ask them to pass on the information about what people are selling?
I think this is absolutely the crux of it. I think that this is just a new way of enforcing pre-existing rules to reflect the changing world of commerce. It also covers services like freelance, like taxi hire and food delivery and short-term accommodation lets and things like that. So these are all things that have been a massive, massive, massive part of the UK economy for the last decade or more. Nigel Farage's kind of representation of it, I think, is a very deliberate misrepresentation. It's certainly not double tax. Paying VAT on what you've bought and then paying income tax on what profit you make is two completely different tax systems, and that's not new for any business. So it's really important to say that. But as a person who was self-employed up until last year, I'm taking this very personally, because it's it's triggering time of year to talk about this. I've just filed my last self-employed tax return form. And I actually think that this could, ironically, be of real assistance. I personally would have benefited from having various parts of my income tracked elsewhere. It's an easier way to do it. And I do think that people should be aware that if they earn a certain amount outside of income tax at source, they have to pay tax. I mean, I certainly had to.
Yes, although, I mean, if you're self-employed, Guy, that's one thing and you're used to filing your own tax returns. But if you're not, to take the example I gave to Rebecca, someone who's a PAYE employee somewhere, they may not even have an accountant. So are they going to be
accountant?
Right. So are they going to be trusted to put these things together and file it properly?
Yeah, it's a good point. I should say, and I think Harriet makes a good point, that this will actually give people visibility, because I think one of the things the platforms have to do is tell you what they've passed on to HMRC, so you will actually get visibility of it. And it's actually easy, isn't it? Like, I don't sell on eBay, but I can look at my Amazon orders and things like that, and it's very easy to see what you've ordered. I'm sure it works the other way around as well in terms of what you've sold. But in terms of people not being used to filing self-assessments or whatever, just go back to my point. If you're selling services or goods to trade, then it's income, and you you should have been doing a self-assessment form anyway. Lots of people listen to this that may have been scared before they listened to this, and we've all said, actually, don't worry so much if you're just getting rid of stuff. They don't have to worry about it anyway. But for the people caught in the middle who are trading but haven't been declaring it, yes, it's going to be an annoyance. And actually, you've actually missed the deadline for the 22-23 tax year, the tax year that ended in April last year, to declare yourself as self-employed for self-assessment purposes. That deadline passed in October, so get on it quickly if that was the case. Although you've got lots of time for this tax year that we're in now. Yes, it's going to be an annoyance, but if you've got good records, when I used to do some freelance on the side, I just made sure I kept good records in an Excel spreadsheet. And every time I got something, I put it down. It means I didn't have to pay an accountant and lose more of the income. If you keep good records along the way, that will reduce the need to, say, have an accountant, creating more cost, of course.
I wonder what the consequences of this will be, Rebecca, for other platforms and other locations. I mean, I'm thinking cash, car boot sales, even Facebook Marketplace, where people don't actually have to complete the sale online, will benefit from this.
Well, I think, as Guy and Harriet have mentioned, it's all about how this is being communicated. And I think as long as people understand the trading allowances, the way that the tax system works, then there's nothing really to be too concerned about, and people shouldn't be put off by, doing their car boot sales or whatever it is. I'm
not saying they'll be put off. I'm saying there will be people who don't want to pay tax and will go and sell their furniture at a car boot sale instead, won't they?
But that happens already, surely.
Isn't this going to make it more likely?
I'm not sure it will. The effort involved in a car boot sale versus the effort involved in selling on eBay. I think, and we're just getting more. We're getting more and more digital, aren't we?
But then, to return to my Facebook Marketplace example, wouldn't it be meeting on a digital platform that doesn't have to report its records, and then meeting in real life and exchanging cash or doing a bank transfer? Do you not think that will happen as a result of this?
I'm not convinced that it will drastically change anything, to be honest. I don't think that there's going to be suddenly thousands or hundreds of people flocking to Facebook Marketplace. Sure, I think some people might see this news and think, okay, well, maybe I dodge here and dodge there and just kind of change the outlook on how they approach these things. But I don't think it's going to radically alter to anything in the way that people go about their business at all.
I think it's also worth noting that under the new rules, the firms won't actually be asked to share any data about sellers who make fewer than 30 transactions a year or the equivalent of £1,735 a year. That's quite a lot. If you were doing more than that, you really should have been paying tax anyway, and you really probably do know that. This tax dodge is going to tax dodge. Do you know what I mean? Like this, I don't think this is going to significantly change the way people approach the possibility of dodging tax that they owe. And I think it's also worth saying that this is actually a small part of a much wider thing. I mean, previously HMRC was able to access this information from UK-based online platforms if they wanted to. The only difference is now it's an automatic sharing process which covers really big overseas platforms, and it's all part of this big agreement internationally that's trying to tackle tax evasion globally. So this is peanuts in the wider picture of trying to clamp down on what is massive tax evasion.
And what about if what you're selling, Guy, isn't an item of furniture or a room in your house, but access to you? I mean, what about the people that are selling on Fiverr and OnlyFans? Is that all taxable as well?
I'm no expert on OnlyFans, but certainly
Let the record show.
if you're selling a service, whether that's a room in your home, whether that's pictures of yourself for whatever people want to use them for, then the likelihood is that is an income and you're trading, and it's not just getting rid of a sterilizer or getting rid of a kettle.
But do those companies have to declare the income as well, or are they excluded at the moment?
So I don't know whether specifically, OnlyFans, for example, are part of the group of companies that have to declare. But the point remains that if what you're doing, and I'm sorry for repeating this, but it's important, if what you're doing is trading, you're deliberately making a profit. So deliberately sounds like it's a bad thing. It's not. But if this is your income, in the same way that we earn income from journalism and what we do, then you're going to have to pay tax on that one. Or should I say, the income is potentially taxable, subject to allowances that you have. So I think that's the important thing. And just going back the whole story, also my key message on this story is, I think it's been overblown. It's a really important one to talk about. My key message is almost trying to just dial down the scaremongering so that people realise you can continue selling old bits and bobs because you just want to get rid of it without having to worry about tax. But if you're trading and making an income from it, it's just like any other type of employment, and it may well attract tax.
Okay, we will continue trading with Rebecca after this. Okay, Rebecca, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Disney in the public domain. Are people about to take the mickey with Mickey?
That is, of course, a clip from Steamboat Willie, the 1928 cartoon featuring Mickey Mouse, directed by Walt Disney, which we do have an editorial justification for playing, as you'll discover. But as of this week, Rebecca, we needn't have an editorial justification. We could have played all of it. Why?
Indeed. So this week, Disney's copyright on the original Mickey Mouse from that 1928 short film Steamboat Willie has expired. So that means the images are now in the public domain in the United States. So that means from New Year's Day, just gone, anyone is able to rework and use the earliest versions of this famous cartoon character without permission or cost. But... and that's a very big but, I think people should be warned that newer and more familiar versions of Mickey are still staunchly protected by the Mouse House, and there are other rules to bear in mind as well.
Right. So that's an interesting thing to test, isn't it? Which I'm sure people are already doing on the internet. I mean, if it's in black and white, then it's clearly Steamboat Willie Mickey, isn't it? But we live in colour and we can film in colour now, so if you did a colour Mickey Mouse, but it was a colour version of the Mickey Mouse from Steamboat Willie, is that in the public domain? Or, I mean, it's quite, even that's confusing, isn't it?
It is. It all is very confusing. I think particularly because there's been so many different iterations of Mickey. But this Steamboat Willie Mickey, or just Steamboat Willie as we're calling it, doesn't have the famous gloves. It's a very kind of original basic version of Mickey Mouse. So perhaps some of the more familiar versions that we've seen, like the Mickey in colour, are still being, well, they're definitely still being protected by Disney.
But there's a bigger story here, isn't there, Rebecca, which is, of course, that Mickey Mouse is not just a character, and this isn't just any cartoon. He is the corporate mascot for one of the largest businesses in the world.
Well, exactly. And Disney is very notoriously protective of Mickey and the characters that are central to its brand. In fact, it has been at the forefront of changing the law with regards to copyright and protections in the United States. So they've lobbied twice to allow owners to retain copyright protections for longer amounts of time. And these laws even derisively became known as the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. That's how staunchly Disney are protecting their character.
But obviously, Guy, they were unable politically in the US to extend copyright any further. Like, it got to the point where, you know, they were able to put some pressure on extended copyright and then no more. Do you think it's at a reasonable balance now, this kind of, whatever it is, 96 years, and then it's in the public domain?
It's a good question. In theory, yes, but also it's their asset. You know, they came up with it. In the same way that, you know, a music producer, that's their asset, or a photographer, that's their asset. Of course, copyright would apply to all those as well, and much more.
Yeah, but the concept of they as a company is slightly odd, isn't it? When Walt Disney himself, he came up with it. He's dead. He's been dead for decades. So at what point do you say, well, that your right to that has gone? That's
why I probably sat on the fence to answer your question, didn't I? Because I probably am on the fence in that one, because I can see both sides of it. But the truth is, I suspect people have been using, you know, that version of Mickey Mouse themselves for years, illegally. It's whether Disney would have come after them. And again, this applies to any type of copyright infringement. You know, if Microsoft or Apple are using that to their advantage, yeah, Disney's going to come after them. If you or I, or actually maybe me, not you, Ollie, because you've got more followers than I do, but if, you know, someone like me on my social media just, you know, accidentally sticks the old picture, they're probably not going to come after me, are they? Small-time infringement has probably gone on for a long time. But no, to answer your question, I'm on the fence around, time versus copyright asset.
I mean, Mickey's obviously a big prize, isn't it? If you're someone who wants to take someone else's copyright and use it in a novel way. But he's not the first character to come into the public domain. Harriet, this has happened before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, actually, it happens every year. Every year on the first day of the year. This is what I really enjoyed about this story, actually, that New Year's Day is public domain day. It's like a fresh trove of vintage artistic creations become available for anyone to use and adapt or even to exploit. The Washington Post has called it that when artworks enter the grab bag marketplace of adaptation, which I thought was a really nice line. But the bellwether, I guess, would be Winnie the Pooh, which entered the public domain in 2022. So the copyright expired, and that led to quite a few different adaptations, but one in particular, this British slasher movie called Blood and Honey, which was very, 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 very controversial. The writer and the director claimed that he and other members of the production team actually received death threats for their reinterpretation of Winnie the Pooh, and there's already been a trailer released for a planned shooter game that looks a lot like Steamboat Willie. So it's really interesting. But I think if you look at all the adaptations that have been done about previously copyrighted works, I mean, they can be absolutely wonderful. You know, there are things coming into the public domain this year, such as Virginia Woolf's Orlando, very, very famous feminist text largely based on the family of her lover Vita Sackwell West. That's already been adapted several times. Very famously, Orlando played by Tilda Swinton, by Isabelle Huppert. So it's not that you can't adapt things that are still in copyright, but it just allows for a little bit more freedom. I mean, for example, with, you know, a wealth of Greek myths and Shakespeare plays that are adapted to suit any era, interpretation, culture, it can be wonderful. And in the case of Disney, I mean, they originally made a fortune adapting, you know, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Sleeping Beauty, those sorts of things. Those weren't, you know, original Disney ideas.
Yes, that's fascinating. We did an episode of Today in History with the retrospectors about Pinocchio, and the fact that I remember from my research on that is that more time has now passed since Disney's film of Pinocchio than the time that had elapsed between the publication of Pinocchio the novel and them doing an adaptation. So it's not as if it was stuff that was all hundreds of years old. Disney, Rebecca, made a fortune by adapting other people's stories in the first place.
Well, exactly. I mean, as Harriet mentions, a lot of the Disney films that we all grew up watching were a result of Walt and Roy Disney borrowing and Disney-fying older works. And that hasn't necessarily, I mean, they've done it in a very nice, family-friendly way, but I think that hasn't necessarily changed how we view those characters in the public consciousness. So similarly, I think that anything that happens to the original Mickey and Minnie after their entrance into the public domain, I don't think it will necessarily change our perspectives on those characters.
I also wonder what financial implications it will really have for Disney, Guy, because as you suggested earlier, people have probably been doing this illegally for decades anyway. We think about all the fun fairs you go to, where people have, in a very crude way, spray-painted Disney characters onto the side of a carousel. Disney company obviously doesn't sue them because people might be confused it's Disneyland. You can see it isn't, but actually it sort of boosts the popularity of their characters, doesn't it? It's putting their characters into child-friendly settings.
It's free advertising for them as well, isn't it? You might see that, and you might, well, maybe this is a push, but some people might go to Disneyland off the back of it, but if nothing else, you're just continuing to promote their brand. And also, as obviously Rebecca pointed out at the very top, we're only talking about the oldest version of Mickey Mouse here. Other elements will still be copyright protected. But I also go back to my point that Disney or any big company will carefully choose which battles to fight. If one of their rivals is breaching copyright for their gain, they're likely to go after them. A small little fun fair in Southsea is, that happens to just paint the wrong Mickey Mouse on the side of their, carousel wheel or whatever, they're less likely to be sought after.
I mean, also in truth, Harriet, Mickey Mouse, yes, he has a huge amount of baggage as a corporate mascot, as I said, and it was groundbreaking. But actually, as a character in Steamboat Willie, he's a mouse with a face on it. Like, what can you actually do? I mean, I wouldn't want to read Steamboat Willie fanfic, would you?
Probably not. But what I think is interesting about Steamboat Willie is, as Rebecca explained, it is the face of Disney's efforts to extend and protect copyrighted material. That, he is actually the face of that, but also the face of Disney being saved from financial ruin, which is what I think is really interesting. It's this bookmarking of the history. So back in 1928, Disney had just lost the rights to its most popular creation and had loads of his staff poached in this big corporate dispute. He was running out of money. So he got his animators to work up this idea of this kind of sympathetic mouse and this series of misadventures. And Steamboat Willie was so successful that it kind of allowed Disney to then dominate the medium. So then go on to create Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And Mickey, this version of Mickey, this actual version that we're talking about, not the later iterations that we know better, but it's this version that saved Disney. And what's really interesting is that Disney is really not having a great year. I mean, they had their centenary last year, and I know that Rebecca can talk about this further, but Disney really needs a win.
It's horriblest for Disney, to put it lightly. The magic has really faded for them this year, and it was meant to be their 100th birthday. They were meant to be celebrating that in style, but they've had a series of poor releases. For example, the film The Marvels was the lowest grossing release to come from Marvel Studios, and Wish, the film Wish, which was intended to celebrate Disney's animation, was beaten on its opening weekend by several other releases. This is the first year since 2014 that none of Disney's films broke the $1 billion barrier. So yeah, the magic could be disappearing for Disney, really.
But it's also fair to say it's not just to do with Disney's failures and lots of flops and superhero fatigue last year. It's also related to the rivals' successes, right? Because I mean, the three biggest films of last year, Oppenheimer, Barbie, and the Super Mario Brothers movie, they were all made by Disney's rivals. So it's not just, and it's also worth saying, I think, yes, 2019 was Disney's Annus Horribilis, but also it's still, we're not saying that it's not a profitable company. I mean, they're still making a fortune. It just so happens that what should have been their big, flashy centenary year last year, as Rebecca mentioned with Wish, turned out to be kind of a slump.
What else has become public domain this year? I know that Let's Do It, Let's Fall in Love by Cole Porter is also up for grabs now, so I could burst into song with that. No one will care.
We've also got All Quiet on the Western Front coming into the public domain as well this year. The original novel, I mean, obviously it's already been very successfully adapted, but the original novel, the play Peter Pan, again, it's also already very many successful reinterpretations and adaptations, and Lady Chatterley's Lover too. That's
interesting. Lady Chatterley's Lover as well, rather than Lady Chatterley's Lover 2, which is a sequel you could now write. And what about next year, Rebecca?
Well, yeah, there's some stuff to look forward to next year as well. I mean, Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, and on the cartoon sphere, Popeye. So lots to look forward to on Public Domain Day on the 1st of January 2025.
Guy, if you could take any character and make them public domain, who would you choose and what would you do with them?
It's got to be James Bond. I mean, he's just an absolute legend. So lots more James Bond if it was available.
I'd probably say Villanelle. Of the Villanelle novels, and famously played by Jodie Comer in Killing Eve, the psychotic, extremely fascinating and very kind of sexually overt female assassin. I absolutely loved her. I loved Villanelle as a character. I'd want to see a lot more of her.
I wasn't interested in either of your suggestions, but I do quite like the idea of a mashup where Villanelle takes on James Bond, which of course would be possible one day.
James Bond would lose in that fight.
He'd have a better cocktail though. That's it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Harriet, Rebecca and Guy. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Pitt at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, Happy New Year.